You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for July 9th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, as we travel back to the 1980s.
1985 specifically.
The year I was born, even. How
Oh my
exciting.
gosh. I can't believe I didn't pick up on that when I saw that year pop up early on
Yeah.
in the movie. I should have thought, oh, that's my co-host's birthday. Oh, that's cute.
I was born that year, so we're going back to the future. It's very exciting.
Very different movie.
Very different movie, yeah. But we're going back to the 80s, obviously, as we are here to talk about MaXXXine, the third of Ty West trilogy. And I'm very excited because we do have a guest for this review. I'm very excited
Yeah.
to bring back onto the show the wonderful, the great, the handsome Gerald from Two Peas on a Pod. Gerald, welcome back to the show, my friend.
What's up, gentlemen? I have made it. I'm back on In Session Film. Finally,
Love it.
8
Love
years
it.
of podcasting. I made it to my end goal. I could quit now. How we doing?
The greatest beard in film Twitter returns.
Not even close. Yeah.
There it is.
You will always hold
A lot
that.
more gray in it than the last time I talked to you guys, probably. But yeah, thank you.
I don't know.
Brendan.
My wife tells me that kind of salt and pepper look is just sexy nowadays.
Okay.
So I think
Alright.
you're on the right track.
All right,
Yeah.
I'll take it. I'll take it.
I love it. No, I think it's great.
I am.
It's-
I'm
it's-
thrilled to be here with you dudes, though. JD,
Oh
I've
my
told
gosh,
you this
yes.
before, but man, I love you guys. I love this show.
Thank you.
And
appreciate it.
anytime I can carve out 5.5 hours to listen to a movie review, it's In Session Film.
That's fair.
But
totally
no,
fair.
you guys know I'm big fans, and I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah.
so.
No,
Thanks,
yeah,
man.
we're super glad to have you here. We're big fans of yours as well. I've always loved coming on to your show, so I'm glad that we could return the favor
Yeah,
and get you
absolutely.
on for a film that the predecessors of have been featured quite heavily on your show
True.
with your award shows that you've done in the past, which is very exciting. So I'm curious, absolutely curious and excited to hear what you think about MaXXXine. So as we jump into this, I guess let's start there quickly. We don't have to spend too much time here, but to bring some context to the conversation, let's talk briefly about X and Pearl. How do we feel about those two films coming into MaXXXine? So, Gerald, why don't you start with that? Well, how do you feel about X and Pearl on their own terms?
All right, I can do that for sure. Not to bury the lead on my MaXXXine thoughts. I'll try to keep that under wraps for a couple minutes. But
Okay.
Pearl for me stands alone. It's borderline masterpiece in my opinion.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Best performance of Mia Goth's career in my opinion. I just love how Ty West. I mean, he does this with all his movies, so let's be honest. But I love in Pearl how he really captures a time and a place. And when I reviewed this movie initially when it came out, I don't know if I was the first one to say it, but I said that it kind of reminded me of The Wizard of Oz if Dorothy snapped and started killing everyone. It was a very wholesome setting on a farm and this kind of innocent farmhand, and it just turns into, what it turned into, absolute bedlam.
Yeah.
And I loved it. I loved how the horror tropes were there and the DNA of the horror genre was there, but it was in such a unfamiliar setting to that genre, and it was just really captivated me. It's one of my favorite films of the last 10 years, to be honest.
Yeah.
X, I also really, really enjoyed. I am a sucker for, we're going to talk about MaXXXine tonight, in the 80s even more so, but I'm also a sucker for that that 1970s, like, wood paneling era, CCR days, like that just gritty, grimy Texas Chainsaw type of backwoods.
Like outlaw country in some
Feel.
ways.
Yeah, for sure. So I loved X as well. I can't remember right now, but I love both of them very much. I want to say I gave X like an 8 out of 10, and Pearl was like a 9 out of 10. Both were just extremely. I'm very fond of both of those films.
Yeah. Yeah. I love both of them as well. At the time when I first saw both of them, I loved X immediately. Pearl took some time for me to learn to love. I think what I loved so much about X was not just the rural griminess that you're talking about there, but there was also like a deeply unsettling and kind of under the surface melancholy to X. Like I felt like Pearl, as an older character in that movie, there were layers to Mia Goth's performance that made me sort of recontextualize what that film was going for. And then Pearl kind of justified some of those things. So I was a little bit at an arm's length with Pearl at first until I started to see it as its own thing, like you're talking about there, Gerald, as its own sort of weird experimental mixture of Technicolor old school films with horror. To the point that I don't think I've ever seen anything like Pearl. Even to this day, I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. And if I isolate that film in its own terms and look at it in a vacuum, it's a really tragic story about parental neglect in many ways, among other things. It has all those things to it. And I've learned to love Pearl even more, and might be my favorite of those two. Not going to get my thoughts out there yet on MaXXXine. We'll get to that point in just a little bit. But long story short, I do love both those films as well.
Yeah, I love them as well. I'm a little bit on the other end of the spectrum from Brendan in the sense that I really liked X. I did have to grapple with that film a little bit more, although to Gerald's point about the aesthetics and that late 70s visual style it has, that element of the film was really great. Pearl, I fell head over heels in love with immediately. It is one of my favorite horror films of this decade so far. I think it is quite masterful in many regards. And I think it's not just the aesthetics of it, which are equally captivating for sure, but it's so incredibly subversive in its horror tactics. I mean, that's a film where it actively avoids the violence for much of the film. I mean, that's a movie about a
Instead,
young
you get a
woman
sex scene with a
yearning for love
scarecrow.
and well, you certainly get that, but I mean, it's about a young woman yearning for love and acceptance, to want to dance and be on the silver screen, but life has left her lonely and vulnerable, and the horror is born out of that in the end, but it's all handled with this incredible subtlety that I love. And Mia Goth's performance in that film specifically took my breath away. It is absolutely astounding. As far as horror films go, I mean, that is cream of the crop. I absolutely love Pearl. I fell in love with it immediately. It's really good. But I do think both of them are extremely complementary to each other, and because of that, I was certainly very, very excited to get into MaXXXine. So
what's interesting too, before we get there, JD, what's interesting too about Pearl is that it was inserted as the second film in the trilogy. MaXXXine really is a sequel to X. I mean, those two films kind of go together, and Pearl, as I said in my intro, stands on its own. Like, Pearl could be the only film that was even in this universe, and it would work as kind of its own thing. It's interesting the way it was chosen to be released. And I know Mia Goth was a co-writer on these films and stuff. So the order of release is interesting to me, and I wanted that to be a segue for when we get to MaXXXine, because I wonder if that was maybe to its detriment when you're looking at the trilogy as a whole, kind of coming off of Pearl.
It's a great point, and I think it's kind of a double-edged sword in some ways. I think by having Pearl as the middle chapter, it does a great job creating these more thematic parallels, but it doesn't really create this narrative cohesion that you would expect from a trilogy. In many ways, it almost feels like the spin-off from a two-part series. Do the three of them work just as well if, let's say, you watch Pearl first, and then you watch X, and then MaXXXine? They'd work differently, I think. I don't know if it'd be better or worse. It just creates a different thematic trajectory, if that makes sense.
it does. And I'm like, I think Pearl, emotionally speaking, does give X a little bit more heft. Although I still think X on its own terms does a really great job with Pearl's own characterization there. That if Pearl never existed, I still think that's a very good movie that balances its characters very well. But Pearl certainly adds nuance that I absolutely adore. We'll get into MaXXXine. I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here, but MaXXXine is a movie where you don't have to see Pearl to enjoy MaXXXine, but you do need to see X.
Yeah,
Those two films are
so
tethered
interesting to
Gerald's
say
point.
it that way. And I've seen
Yeah.
a lot of people tweet it out that way. It's like it's such an interesting way to recommend a trilogy with those words. Like I've never seen anything like that.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, with that laid out, let's go ahead and jump into MaXXXine then. It is, of course, written and directed by Ty West. It stars Mia Goth once again, alongside Elizabeth Debicki, Moses Sumney, Michelle Monaghan, Bobby Cannavale, and a slew of others that come and go throughout the film, including Kevin Bacon. I guess we got to mention Kevin Bacon.
Oh, we
He is
definitely have to
a
mention
big part of
Kevin
this
Bacon.
film.
Absolutely.
Oh, and those grills, yeah, we have to mention.
Oh, man.
Absolutely. If you're not familiar with MaXXXine, this is a film that takes place in 1980s Hollywood, where adult film star and aspiring actress Maxine Mix finally gets her big break, but a mysterious killer stalks the starlets of Hollywood. A trail of blood threatens to reveal her sinister past. All right, let's jump into it. We'll start with you, Gerald. What did you think about MaXXXine?
I need to ask, are we spoilery or not quite yet?
We'll save that to the end. We'll start off non-spoilers, but we can
No
we can get
spoilers.
to that later if we need to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't say why, but I will say that this film had me lockstep, had its claws in me for the first like 2/3 of the movie, and then it fell off a cliff. The last 20 to 30 minutes, the last act essentially really lost me. And when we do talk spoilers, I can explain a little or try to explain why. But I'm interested to see what your two backgrounds are in horror history, if you will, because Ty West obviously employed a lot of his influences in this movie.
Yeah.
And as a fan of movies like Angel and Body Double and Tenebrae and Hardcore, a lot Fade to Black, even Boogie Nights to a certain extent.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of films throughout the 80s and 90s that I've seen many, many times, and I saw when I was way too young, and hit you in a certain way when you see them between the ages of like 12 and 15 years old, which is when I saw a lot of those films, those kind of 80s horror exploitative films. And I loved what he was doing. I loved the kind of innuendo nods that he was giving to that era of the Hollywood sleaze that we got in this movie. The problem with me with the film is the lack of culmination in the storytelling, and how I just was not, again, I don't want to spoil it quite yet, but I just was not satisfied with what ends up being the climax in this film, and I didn't feel like it was a proper send-off to a trilogy that I'm in love with. I think even with my mixed feelings on MaXXXine, I do think this is one of the greatest horror trilogies of all time, and I'm just going to go on record saying that, of all time. I'm not just talking about a modern.
Well, okay.
You know, he put together something here that, I mean, he edits his own films. The guy's a psycho. I mean,
Yeah.
no pun,
It's
no
incredible.
pun intended with the heavy-handed psycho pieces of this film.
Yeah.
But, you know, the guy, in my opinion, is a genius, and especially when you're talking about horror storytelling. I mean, this is a unique story. I didn't like the way it ended. Like I said, we're only talking about 20 minutes here, though. You know, if I'm talking about 20 minutes of 6 hours, you know what I mean? So I feel like he did something really special. I just wanted something more from the kind of climax in MaXXXine.
Yeah. Well, with that, for those listening, be sure to like and subscribe to us and everything, because I think we pretty much got everything out of the way there. That sums up more or less how I feel about this movie. I tweeted about this, that this is not just a movie that takes place in the 80s. It's a movie about the 80s. It's about the art of 80s art, censorship, the impurities of it. It doesn't even just talk about cinema of this time or horror cinema of this time, because you're right, Gerald, there are all these references to Paul Schrader and Brian De Palma and many others as well, but the movie also has a reverence for 80s hair metal, of all things, which is one of the most hated music genres of all time when you think about it. I mean, there's archival footage in the beginning of Dee Snider and Tipper Gore. It has all of those things, and I found that referential side really interesting. And it's all pastiche, but for the most part, it's very entertaining pastiche. I actually think the film does a pretty good job maneuvering these different parts to have an overarching idea about the 80s, even if the individual parts feel like their own separate stories in many ways. I think that's maybe where the Boogie Nights comparison comes into play, that it almost feels like one of these multi-character stories of interlocking stories and interlocking characters. And I thought for the most part, the film was working with that kind of agenda. I do agree that, and it took me some time to ponder on this because I knew this was my least favorite of the three. I knew I was entertained by it, but I couldn't help but think I wasn't fulfilled by it in the same way that I was Pearl and X. And I thought it maybe had to do with the fact that it was just pastiche, that maybe it wasn't going deeper into some of the emotional nuances that those first two films did. But I think a lot of my problems really do stem from the third act. I do think the third act is kind of a dud. I think it tries to crystallize some of these ideas in a completely different way, in a way that's also very predictable, but also just not nearly as it's not nearly as defined by what the film seems to set itself up as. Like, I feel like it sets itself up as something else and then becomes something else in the third act.
I agree.
And we'll certainly talk more about it further, but that might be my biggest problem with it as well. So
And
I was certainly entertained by it, but yeah, definitely my least favorite of the three, but it's still a fascinating trilogy nonetheless.
And the bummer too, before JD, I'm sorry. The bummer too is that the third act is not about MaXXXine, which kind of drove me crazy. I mean, the whole trilogy, the through line is her kind of desire to be a star. You know, I'm going to be a star. And that third act, I'm just like, where is she? What are we doing here? What's? I would almost rather see what happens next. You know, like what happens to MaXXXine after this? Like that would be a really interesting movie. I feel like. Now, I'm not saying I necessarily, but I don't know. We'll get into. I don't want to. JD, go ahead. I'm sorry.
We'll leave it there because I have more thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, we can certainly get to that as we go here. I do hate to bring down the vibe a little bit here. I thought this was a real disappointment. I did not like this film all that much. I think it's the worst of the three by a fair margin. Its lack of subtlety, especially off the heels of Pearl, was underwhelming. But given what we see in X and West fully embracing the sleazy grime of the 80s, as you guys are talking about, I can forgive the film's indulgences and Brian De Palma-esque mimicry. The film's real sins lie in its lack of commitment. It has a lot on its mind, and none of it is spoken with conviction. It often feels confused or lost, especially when you consider the story of Richard Ramirez and how that could thematically tie to MaXXXine, but the film refuses to explore that connection in any meaningful way, which renders the parallels thin and extremely unnecessary. Similarly, the reveal of who is really after MaXXXine is mind-numbingly vacuous. If the film was simply an exercise in regurgitating 80s slasher tropes, then its hollow storytelling could be more understandable, but it's the third film in a trilogy that has been anything but sanitized and empty. As we mentioned earlier, what makes X great is that Pearl's motives are emotionally rooted, and West gives her time and space to make her bitterness felt, something that is, and please forgive the terminology here, something that is elevated tenfold when you get to Pearl. You really do feel for her in that movie. The previous two entries in this trilogy are extremely well crafted. They're extremely well performed, but underneath the horror veneer is this incredible thematic nuance and emotional heft. Where is that in this film? It's almost hard to believe this is the follow-up to those movies. And perhaps some of that is me, admittedly. Maybe that wasn't Wes's goal here to continue the trajectory of those two movies. Maybe this is meant to just be a sleazy, trashy 80s mimicry of a slasher film. If that's all it's meant to be, then maybe some of my criticisms are overstated, but I can't fathom that was his goal, given what the first two films of this trilogy are.
No, I think
as
your
an alleged
criticisms are fair.
as an alleged conclusion to a trilogy, that's not the way to conclude a trilogy. So I certainly see where you're coming from there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. If
Exactly.
it was a movie that he released 10 years from now that wasn't connected to the universe, then whatever, if that's
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But kind of like what you're saying, it's got to be a payoff for. I mean, all three of us were talking about how much we love the first two films 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we. I hate using the term deserve because we're just fans. What are we doing? I'm not a
Right,
producer.
right.
You know what I mean? But I feel like we deserved a more kind of substantial and like emotional kind of ending to this trilogy. Now, I'm more with Brendan and less with JD in terms of the film as a whole because I did really like the film. I did find it to be entertaining. And to your point, JD, Ty West kind of teases us with that emotionality and connection to MaXXXine in the very first scene, which is one of my favorite scenes of the whole movie when she goes in for her audition.
It's a great scene.
And Mia Goth is, can I cuss on this show? I mean, she's
We tend not to, but I mean.
Okay, I won't then.
can
I won't
edit
then.
it out,
She
it's
is
fine.
If you're provoked, go for it. If you feel like you need to get your point across that way.
Yeah.
She's an effing queen. I'll just put it that way. She
Sure.
really, much like like the monologue that's often spoken of in Pearl. And X is a little more exploitative, and not necessarily as much as driven to her character, a personality, if you will, but it's a growth and it's a progression, and we see what we saw in X to I think it's 6 years later for MaXXXine, and we see I'm in control now. I have my Mercedes.
Yeah.
I did the adult film industry because I wanted to make a name for myself. I wanted to use it as a gateway to do other things. The Puritan 2, which just a great that whole storyline was great too. So there's a lot of things I loved about it. To where I would recommend it, especially someone that's a fan of Ty West or of some of the movies I mentioned earlier, that kind of 80s Hollywood sleaze kind of era. We got a lot of that stuff. I mean, even like, it wasn't necessarily in Hollywood, but like the Charlie Bronson movies in the 80s, you got that kind of gritty, grimy on the streets, like kind of feel. And I thought Ty West did a good job of kind of translating that here in MaXXXine. I just wish...
Yeah, I think his filmmaking is not necessarily the problem. I actually think he does a good job recapturing the sense of place of 1980s LA. I think that's where the film is at its most successful, and maybe where it sounds like I'm still slightly positive on the film, it's because those first two acts, I was so engaged in hoping for something good to conclude this particular story that we were getting there. I think the pieces were there. It's like we were given these ingredients for a potentially delicious cocktail. Like the pieces weren't quite mixed properly yet. That's what a great conclusion is there for. But I like the ingredients of an old fashioned. Let's say I like the bitters. I like the bourbon. I like all those things. And then we get to that ending. It's like, okay, here's processed milk instead.
Why'd
It's
you
like
put lime juice in it, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. It's like it completely deflates every ingredient that could have been great out of that, which is why I'm so torn on this movie. I often talk about how a great ending can make your movie or a bad ending can also break your movie. That's not always the case because sometimes it's also the sum of its parts. Like if it's still the greater than the sum of its parts, how do you want to grade a movie in that way? And the majority of MaXXXine, I was entertained by. I was invested. I wanted to see where it was going to go.
And you were hopeful.
Sadly, where it goes is it wouldn't surprise me if by the end of the year I call it the most deflating climax of the year. I really do think it is that unfortunate because it had all these great ideas that it really didn't do anything with, which is where I think your criticisms are valid, JD. I think there was potential to lock these things in, and it fails to do that for something that was incredibly myopic when we got to that third act reveal.
Yeah, I mean, I do wish that I was more compelled by this film in a diverting way, as you guys are talking about. It's clear that West has an admiration for slasher films of the 80s and wanted to tap into certain tropes and aesthetics for this film. I do appreciate its grimy visuals and color palette. There's a scummy murkiness to each frame that on its own terms is engrossing, but as each sequence unfolds, especially in context of the narrative here and its plotting core, the references that West utilizes become more and more sanitized, and eventually they undermine the film's quite obvious commentary on Hollywood and women and art and standards in the industry, not to mention
And religiosity at that time too.
Yeah,
That's kind of the
course.
big thing, which the
Satanic
movie
Panic
basically,
was real.
yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
the incessant archival clips of Ronald Reagan and other politicians and newscasts about the Night Stalker that evoked the Satanic Panic movement. I'm honestly not sure what any of that means in this film beyond the superficial background it provides. Maybe that's all it's meant to be. If that's the case, I do find that pretty superfluous. And then there's Elizabeth, played by Elizabeth Debicki, the director of this movie that Maxine is in, who may as well be talking directly to the goddamn camera when she's monologuing. It is painfully transparent.
She's a theme translator, is what she is.
Yeah, there is a playfulness to it that I do kind of love, but there
It's not her
isn't-
performance; it's the writing.
Yeah, there isn't any conviction to it to give it any heft. We know that Hollywood has a history of exploiting artists and leaving them to the vultures once they're devoured. What are you wanting to say about that with this film? It seems as if West wants to scream something, but it comes out muted and jumbled. And I found that extremely frustrating. And I think that's ultimately why that diverting quality that you guys are talking about, I couldn't quite grasp onto, because intermingled with all of those tropes and the fun that could be had here, it is crushed by these incessant, loud commentary components that lead to absolutely nothing, that have
That
no
right there is the
voice
problem.
or weight
Yeah.
in this film whatsoever. And you compound that with the third act that you guys are talking about, that is even more bland and confused. And it just left the whole experience just extremely muffled for me.
You know, it hasn't come out yet, but we covered the show or this movie on my show this week, and I didn't do this on purpose, but in real time, you guys will never guess what movie I brought up to kind of make a comparison. But I talked about James Cameron's Titanic. Hang on, stay with me.
There's a point to this. I can't
Stay
wait
with
to
me.
hear it.
Yeah, my heart will go on, guys. Hang on. So Cameron takes this real life American historical thing that we all know, that it hits the iceberg, it sinks. You know, all these people were based on real people that were on the ship. So it's a revisionist history, right? Because it's like
Sure.
the historical thing is still happening, but we have this fictional story kind of playing out in that setting. I wish that's what Maxine had done with the Night Stalker, because Ramirez, and that's a fascinating serial killer. Everybody's obsessed with true crime, but this is one of the more fascinating serial killers of the modern era.
Absolutely.
And if the Night Stalker, and I'm not necessarily even saying Ramirez, maybe it could have been, maybe we didn't need a name, you know, it could have just been presumed that it was the Night Stalker, but maybe that's tied in some way. Maxine ends up bringing him down. I don't know, you know what I mean? But it could have been just a retelling, kind of like Quentin did in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
I was just going to say that example
Yes.
right there. Yeah.
You know, but
Glorious
I don't know. I
Bastards
mean,
kind of thing, yeah.
it was just a vapid final act, because it, like what you're saying, even with all the marketing leading up to the release, I was so excited for it. And it's Night Stalker this, Night Stalker that. They use actual news footage from the
Yes.
80s when the Night
Yeah.
Stalker was active. And then we don't, I mean, that's it, though. I mean, that's it. That's all you get is those little clips
It's
of them
there.
talking about it.
Yeah.
It's all background.
You're right. And that's such a big problem here, too, because there's a great opportunity to be revisionist in that way. And I think that would have been a really fascinating way to go about it. The Night Stalker himself, from a historical standpoint, is really just, it's not even a MacGuffin. It's just it's just background noise. And I do think that is there. It's unfortunate because there was, and again, I don't want to make it sound like we're trying to review a movie that we wanted that we didn't get. You know, I don't like
Right.
to do that. I think most critics don't like doing that. But there was a possible opportunity to maybe find a way to fuse these films' themes with maybe the historical ramifications of the Night Stalker. And I feel like the film is trying to set it up that way. Instead, it goes down a route that I called it predictable earlier, because the film kind of reveals how the movie is going to end literally within the first 30 seconds.
Yes.
maybe this is our way to slowly transition into spoilers, because I feel like just saying
Sure,
that might
yeah.
be giving too much
Yeah.
away. But I was sitting there thinking, okay, I'm halfway through this film. I feel like I know where it's going to end, because all of these seeds about not just this Puritan movie that is being made in the overarching narrative, but all of these ideas on religious fanaticism playing into this, about how religious groups are trying to denounce 80s art and the impurities of 80s art. Does that mean this ending is going to be about those things? I surely hope not, because everything else around that is more fascinating.
Yeah.
And of course, it goes down that route anyway. And I found that really unfortunate.
I agree. And that's why it was a struggle for me to even grasp onto some of the more fun elements. Even in a vacuum, if I did enjoy those sequences, it felt like it was immediately smothered by those obtuse qualities.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why this film needs to invoke the Night Stalker or Reagan or those religious ideas that you're talking about there, when it leads to absolutely nothing. And to something that Gerald said earlier, the biggest frustration in all of that is that MaXXXine herself is completely lost in all of this as a character. At times she comes off a little abrasive, which is some of it is her personality, but there is an arc here, if you can even call it, given the execution of this film. But there's
barely.
something interesting to her, that she is this killer who's learned to take care of herself. And as a result, she doesn't have much empathy for anyone else, except for one moment where she does respond emotionally. But again, it's in complete contradiction to the whole Night Stalker thing, because we know that the Night Stalker is only interested in young women, making me question further why that's even in this film. And at the end of the film, she does finally come around. She does have a small epiphany, but by that point, the film had failed to really explore her motives and why she had this sudden change. And so it comes off extremely manufactured. And you couple that with the religiosity of it that you were just talking about there, Brennan, and the ending of this film. I don't even know if there's a word to describe it. It's dreadful.
It's so myopic.
It's just
It is
bad.
so myopic.
Yeah, I agree.
It's a terrible question to ask you, JD, because I feel like this could be applied to any film, and I think the answer is always yes, depending on the execution. But had this film concluded in a different way that took those individual ideas that both Gerald and I really found fascinating and actually found a way to make it work, would you have been a lot higher on this film and actually been able to forgive some of those other maybe blemishes you had early on?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why, I wanted to start off my opening thoughts that this is a film that lacks subtlety. I can't remember, one of you joked about the Psycho moment. I mean, it
That was
does not
Gerald.
get more more artificial than that.
Heavy-handed.
Yeah, and there's all the slasher references of the 80s. You can't help but sense Brian De Palma all over this film. Like, I feel like I could enjoy those things more if everything else around it was fully realized. Absolutely. Even if it was in full, it didn't come together fully, but I think
if there was a point to all of those things, because
exactly.
by the end of this movie, you realize there really was no point to those things.
There was no point. And to, going back to MaXXXine, the epiphany that she has, it's manufactured, and then it also leads to nothing as far as her stardom. What does she really want? Like, the epiphany itself.
That's why I said the next chapter may be even more. Or would
I
be,
agree.
I think, even more enthralling.
I agree, because I think the way that this movie ends, if I were to give any credit to the ending in any way, I think the way that MaXXXine becomes a star is at least kind of interesting, given the circumstances of what actions that she chooses to take in that moment, and how it's almost like the Taxi Driver effect, where someone like Travis Bickle becomes well regarded as a hero because of the torturous acts of violence he commits, and it actually leaves us as the audience a little bit, I'm not sure about that. There's kind of an ickiness to that. And I think this film ends with a similar kind of ickiness, that she's celebrated by the public for what she did, but there is still a grossness to that, which is why I agree, Gerald. Maybe like emphasizing that grossness and that nuance and that complexity further in another outing would be a much more fascinating story. Maybe that takes place in the 90s when her career is about to wash up as bands like Pearl
Perhaps.
Jam and Alice in Chains
Yeah.
start taking over the
There
charts.
you go. Sure, yeah, I'd be in for that. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we need something to fix, the ending of this one.
Yeah, there needs to be a coda. Yeah, we gotta circle back.
Yeah.
I guess with where we're at now, we can go ahead and transition to spoilers. I know that we want to talk about the ending of this film, so
Yeah.
spoiler warning for the rest of this conversation. I actually want to toss it back to you, Gerald, because I know you were itching to talk about the ending of this film in detail. So why don't you talk about that, going back to your opening thoughts, why the third act for you did not work?
Sure. Well, I mean, we kind of touched on, from a generic perspective, kind of what I was feeling anyway. And Brendan's right that you don't want to get into a trap where you're like reviewing something that didn't happen. You know what I mean? So I don't
Yeah.
want to do
Yeah.
that either. But I just feel like there were definitely, for the best way to put it, like missed opportunities here to
Yeah.
bring that first 2/3 of the movie to fruition for us that were bought in. Like it sounds like me and Brendan were bought in.
Yeah.
The ending of the film, when she, by the way, it was very rushed too, which I hated. She has the
Yeah.
address to that house, or to the house on the Hollywood Hills, and it's really quick, and she's like there, and I don't know, it just happened really.
The mechanics
quickly.
are really weird, honestly.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
first-
There was no like tension build up to her deciding to do that. She goes there by herself. I know it was just really weird. So I get the representation of the satanic panic and kind of the whole vibe that existed in 1985, especially in Hollywood. I mean, that was a real thing. I mean, you can watch documentaries on it. I mean, it existed.
Yeah.
Some people might say it still does, but nevertheless, I get the whole iconography that around that and its representation in the movie and in that final act. I just don't think that connected to the rest of the film. Like
I agree.
Yes.
nothing felt like a payoff for me. Like even if I enjoyed anything about it, what am I watching here? Like this is not the culmination of what I've been watching. So I hated the father character. I hated that performance. I hated that over the top kind of overzealous,
Yeah.
I don't even know how to describe, animated character almost, like didn't seem
Yeah.
like a real
Like a
dude.
caricature.
Like nobody acts like this, you know what I mean? No matter how crazy they might be.
But it even tonally felt so disconnected from the 80s pastiche as well.
Yes.
Right.
That's the other problem I have too.
Right. Now, what I did love about the final act, and also to Brendan's point, kind of the quote unquote maybe hopeful cliffhanger. I don't know, but that kind of part of it I did dig too, and kind of wanting, it's always good. I feel like when a filmmaker says like, this is it. Like Alex Garland just did Civil War, right? And he came out and said, I'm not going to direct any more movies or whatever. And you watch that with a different heft to it, knowing that might be the last Alex Garland film you make. I'm just using that as an example because I do like when filmmakers end something, like this is a trilogy, so this is the third one, so that's it, right?
Yeah.
But they end it and you want more. You don't feel like it's finished.
Yeah.
So I do kind of respect that it kind of does leave a little craving there for the fans of the franchise. But what I really did like about the final act, aside from all that kind of abstract stuff, is the shootout. I thought was cool because I don't know if you guys are familiar with a film called Vice Squad or Miss 45 from that era. Those types of shootouts with the Hollywood sign and I'm sorry. The weird the weird lighting or whatever, that's very reminiscent to what he was doing in the first 2/3 of the movie from a different perspective, from this kind of like cop drama kind of action thing. So it just, the easiest way to put it is it just didn't connect to the rest of the movie. It felt like a short film that was different from the first two acts of the film, and it was just, I am recommending this movie as a whole because I did love so much about it throughout, and I've loved Mia Goth since A Cure for Wellness in 2016. I've been a huge fan of her. She's a very unique,
fascinating movie.
interesting.
What a
Yeah,
fascinating movie that one is.
it really was. Yeah.
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 But just an interesting actress that really sinks her teeth into whatever she's doing, and you can tell she really goes for it. And she's kind of become a meme as of late of being crazy and all this stuff, but she plays it really well. But I just gonna tell you right now, like she is,
She's good at it. She's good.
that's her thing. You know, that's her niche. So there's a lot of things about this I liked, but everything I disliked, you can find in the last 20 minutes of this film.
Yeah, I think if anything, if we had to really segment those final 20 minutes into the one thing that doesn't work, it really just is the reveal, the killer reveal. I feel like in many ways, the only reason why that occurs in the way that it does is Ty West needed some way to tie this back to X. So he thought, I'm going to bring back Simon Prast, who played the televangelist from that movie. And
Yeah.
oh, guess what? That is MaXXXine's father. Ooh, isn't that neat? And of course, this movie already has some of those themes on Satanic Panic, as you talked about there, Gerald. So let's hone in on that. But then you just pick one little aspect of this movie when it was about so many other things. Like I said, this movie is about the 80s. It's about all of these things. How does this conclude in a way that encompasses all of those things, that creates a satisfying mixture? And that's where I think it is so unfortunate in the way that it concludes. But I do like the aesthetics of that shootout. I think it's a fairly well shot shootout. I think it's well choreographed in that regard. But I kept thinking, to what point? And that really is the stifling moment for me.
Yeah.
And it was more pastiche, like you mentioned earlier, just from a different, kind of
Yeah.
perspective. But
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the disconnect for me as well. I mean, in a vacuum, I could watch the sequence unfold in terms of the choreography and the action and enjoy it, but I don't think it services the story that's here or the characters, MaXXXine especially, as you guys are talking about, and it crystallizes in this way that is extremely deflating, especially when you consider everything we've talked about, whether it be the Satanic Panic stuff, the Night Stalker. Again, all of these archival footage that either relates to the 80s culture itself, politics of the 80s, newscasts that evoke things that seemingly tie to the story of MaXXXine. And superficially, you do see the parallels there, but the film doesn't explore it at all. And I think as a result of everything that it's trying to do, not only do those things simply simmer in the background and leading to absolutely nothing, but it's a disservice to MaXXXine's arc, because what does she do in this film, really? She has these interactions.
She walks around LA.
She walks around LA. She has these extremely flat interactions with the Detective Williams and Tori's characters, where she is constantly avoiding them. And even when she is confronted, she tells them flat out, like, I don't care. Like, I don't care about any of this. Like, what can I do? And that abrasiveness does have an arc to it, but by the time she has any sort of epiphany, the film doesn't explore why she has this sudden change of heart. There's a simple image that evokes maybe a memory of someone that she had just met. I don't know if that's enough, or if it's some of the Miami Vice thing, for those that have listened to our review of that here on the show. But a big talking point in that review, Brendan, was the performances and how the camera captures their motives simply by how the camera or the performers interact with the camera. If that is the idea here with Mia Goth, and I hate to frame it this way because I do love her as an actress, but if the intent is, it's Mia Goth's performance and she evokes that epiphany, I think the film fails in that regard. I don't think that Goth does enough to make that work. But I
think it's a combination of things. Yeah, I think it's a combination.
I think it's a combination of things.
Yeah,
the
I agree.
screenplay really sells her
agree.
short here for sure.
Yeah, the
I
screenplay
agree.
does. I think Ty West as a filmmaker and what he's trying to capture and how it's edited, especially, I think cuts those potential moments short as well. It's why this is such a stacked cast. This is easily probably the best casted of all the three films in this trilogy. but many of them are only in maybe one scene. Lily Collins is basically a glorified cameo.
Yep.
And
Right.
in some of the detective-y stuff between Michelle Monaghan and Bobby Cannavale, I think I think they have a fun dynamic, but they're really just there to push the plot along. Same with Kevin Bacon. He's snarly. He
Yeah.
eats up the scenery
I want
as
to
he
talk
always
about.
does.
I want to. I want to
Yeah,
talk about his
I'll
character
introduce and
for
I'll
sure.
toss it back to you. But I personally think if you wrote his character out of the movie doesn't change at all.
Right.
At least in a little bit. But I at least appreciate Kevin Bacon for, taking on the challenge to deliver something memorable out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to say too, real quick to JD's point too. I had a thought in my head, and I was waiting to get it out. I might have to go to Brendan's thought next, but what I was going to say about what JD was making about her epiphany and the climax of her character. What bothers me too is that Ty West hints at it throughout the movie. Like,
Yeah.
we have that opening scene where she's really got that powerful audition, and she leaves the audition, and she's like, "You all should just go home right now.
I nailed this.
Yeah, I just nailed this."
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
She has the part where she attacks Kevin Bacon when he's following her in the car. She has the ball stomp, which is our body horror
Oh, yep.
in the alleyway.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's a lot of moments of her in that role of taking charge of her life and her career, but we just don't stay with it. Do you know what I mean? Then she
Yeah, we
becomes in the background to all this other weird stuff going on.
And that's why I wanted to emphasize whether it be the facade of all of these 80s aesthetics and references and influences that I do think the film gets bogged down in, and especially all of the stuff that lingers in the background that we mentioned earlier. It takes space away from exploring that further with MaXXXine, because there are a lot of moments where the film emphasizes the idea that she is this powerful figure that can take care of herself, and you certainly highlighted a few of them. I think of that moment where she barks back at Detective Williams, the Michelle Monaghan character, like, what am I supposed to do? Like, I don't care. Like, she does not have any empathy for anyone else.
Right.
And we do empathize with her because of context we've seen in X, which is why you have to see that film coming into this one. Otherwise,
Agreed.
her arc in this film is even more baffling. But as a result of that abrasiveness in the character and having somewhat of an understanding, why the sudden change? The film spends maybe 3 seconds on that. And again, that's where one close-up on Mia Goth, I don't know, is, at least for me here, it did not work.
And to Brendan's point, that could be an editing issue. That could be
Yes. I don't think it's necessarily a Goth issue.
right.
Yeah.
For clarity, but
To get back to Kevin Bacon too, I mean, I love Mia Goth. I mean, it's no, I mean, I could be arrested for hiding in the bushes in front of her house tomorrow. I mean, I love her, so it's no mystery to anybody.
We won't
that knows
tell anybody.
yeah.
But Kevin Bacon is a definition of a scene stealer in this movie. Does he need to be there? Not necessarily. Am I ear to ear grinning when he's there? Absolutely.
Yeah,
Like,
same.
just full on ham performance. And one of my favorite performances of his, where he has a very small role, is in JFK, and I think 1991, and he has that really heavy Louisiana accent when he's a prison inmate in that movie. He brought that back for this movie, which was pretty cool for me from a nostalgia perspective. But he's this detective from the Bayou, or this PI from the Bayou, and he's just got that really heavy Bayou accent and the big glasses, and then after he sustains all these injuries, he has the tape on his nose and all this stuff. I mean, it's just so memorable, and I think Brendan said that earlier. It's just a very memorable performance that doesn't really do anything for the plot, but you cannot forget him when you see him in this movie. And I love that he is back in the horror genre too. He's done a couple other things recently that were in the horror genre as well, but this one is probably the most that you can tell he was just kind of devoted to it,
Yeah.
He's the one fun element of the film that I loved. that I don't think was distracting from the film at all.
Well, he takes advantage of how underwritten his character is, because every
Yes.
character here is more or less a cameo in many ways. You have Singer Halsey in this movie who does absolutely nothing. And that's a great opportunity to do something there. I feel like Lily Collins maybe does the next most outside of Kevin Bacon,
Yeah.
and at least leaves a point. Elizabeth Debicki, maybe, but to your point earlier, JD, the writing of her monologuing is so direct and so on the nose. It's hard to actually see the performance underneath the obviousness.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I think that's maybe more of a writing issue than it is an Elizabeth Debicki issue. But many of these other actors who I love here are the script and the direction don't give them that same opportunity to stand out in the ways that I think that this cast should stand out. Outside of Kevin Bacon and Lily Collins, like we said, I think they at least make their points heard.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Kevin
Sophie,
Bacon is
Sophie
awesome.
Thatcher's. Yeah, I'm sorry. Sophie Thatcher's in here too. She's a young actress I've got my eye on. She was in The Boogeyman this year, and she's going to be in Heretic later this year, which is an A24 horror. She's the makeup artist and that does the mold on Mia Goth in that one scene. But yeah, I'm kind of with you. I mean, this is where I should say. Let me rephrase this. It should be a Mia Goth showcase, but she gets lost in the
Lost in
storytelling.
the shuffle.
Yeah,
She absolutely does. And then after that, it's Kevin Bacon. I mean, he's just so memorable, and it's one of those supporting roles. It's just like, you would find those kind of roles in the old '80s movies too, where the actor is just this, detective showing up to the scene and has all these stupid one-liners, but you just remember him.
Yeah. Full Ham, as you talked about earlier, and since we're in spoilers, it's fair to say his death scene is maybe the most memorable moment here. It's incredible.
It's just his performance in the moment. It's
Exactly.
It's kind of
It's his
hilarious.
performance.
It's a hilarious death scene.
Yeah.
And also, I didn't think they were going to kill him instantly like that. Like, I thought they were going to use that as a leverage.
Wasted no time.
Well,
I know.
I think this is where the Ty West I like comes to play, where he's really good at subverting expectations.
Right,
Because, I'm
right.
with you. I literally thought in that moment, they're going to do the traditional pause, try to
Stop
get more
it here,
information,
and- yeah.
stop, and then keep going, then get more information,
Right.
and then they'll kill him. But it's like, nah, we don't need him. He's dead. We're done.
he's
let's just
gone.
kill
It's almost
him.
like the movie inadvertently acknowledging, he was a wasted character. He meant nothing to this movie, so let's just kill him in the most fun way.
And that's a really great point, Brennan, and perhaps what makes this film all the more frustrating to me in hindsight, because like it makes perfect sense given what Maxine had already experienced as a result of the events of X, that she would not put up with this. Like, it makes sense in that moment that she would just simply go for it the way she does there.
Yeah.
And where was that Ty West throughout the rest of this movie?
That's
Like,
what I'm
it
saying,
just
yeah.
I don't know. He disappeared.
Because
But
there was
he
some
certainly can play there.
preposterous. Yeah, there were some preposterous things about some of these different things that, even though I may have liked the scenes like that one, like the setup wasn't there for Esposito to be out there with her, like, killing this dude. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, that
I
was
know
weird.
he was
Yeah.
loyal to her and he cared about her career, but it just didn't seem earned that they would be doing this.
And that's where, again, even though we talked about it more in vague terms, and this is a more explicit example, that's where the commentary of this film, again, doesn't work because it's extremely thin. But that is the commentary of the film, talking about the Hollywood system and the people involved and the superficialities of it. Like, the film is trying to use that moment as as part of the commentary, but it just falls flat because, to your point, Gerald, there hasn't been much to connect the dots there.
setup,
Like, it just doesn't make much sense. So yeah,
Did you guys notice the, I think, pretty sweet one shot of her when she went to the strip club? And she ends up, the scene ends with her wearing the nurse's costume, but that's a whole one take where she goes in,
where
she
she's
sees
like
the people
walking
having
through,
sex,
and the camera
yeah.
follows her. Yeah,
I
I
thought
didn't
that
notice
was-
that. I didn't notice that was a one take, which means it's a very good one take. I often
It
say
really
that
is.
the best one takes are ones that you don't realize are one takes because they're not one takey, right? Like, they're not
Right,
calling
right,
attention
right,
to
right.
themselves. So
Right, but
I didn't notice that.
Yeah, but I loved it. It was reminiscent of, like, the Goodfellas kind of one take, and it was a lot shorter than that one, but it was a couple minutes of her going in and the two people are having sex over there, filming the movie, and like it just kind of keeps following her into her dressing room.
I mean,
I thought that was an
to
interesting
that
thing.
point, Gerald, I do think this is a film that you could put on mute and simply look at the grimy aesthetics and the 80s influences and enjoy it from that perspective. And I did,
a well-shot
as I
movie.
mentioned earlier. It is well shot. It is well crafted from that perspective. My issue is more so the execution of how he utilizes the framing and composition, the archival footage, and how it's kind of all intersected. Like it's a major editing nightmare that doesn't come together in terms of the storytelling as we've been talking about. But the individual frames or shots, tracking shots in that specific instance, like I don't have an issue with any of that in a vacuum. It's more so how it comes together as a whole. That's
get it.
my problem.
I'm with
here.
you. Yeah, I'm with you completely.
All right. Any other final thoughts you guys have on MaXXXine?
Soundtrack is an absolute banger.
I was going to
I'm
speak
an
to that as well.
I'm an 80s music junkie. And I also love the choice, I'm assuming of West and probably the music supervisor, but like this was not a typical classic 80s slasher score either. It was very orchestral and like beautiful. Like it was a very
That's Tyler Bates for you.
mismatched
Yeah.
score to that
it
type of cinema. Yeah.
I found it very jarring tonally, which I did like. I did not expect the opening credits to utilize "Give Me All Your Lovin'" by ZZ Top.
Yeah,
it just
I know.
sets a very different tone that I was okay. I'm in, and maybe that's why I enjoyed the first 2/3 as much.
The
as
opening
I did, because
credits sequence is awesome.
It
It's
sets
really
the tone
great.
so much, and I guess
Yeah.
it maybe created this like sensation that I just couldn't lose, which is why I was still able to find myself entertained by everything else. With regard to the soundtrack, though, and I don't know how the royalties may or may not have worked, but for a movie like this that is as dirty and scummy and grimy of an 80s look and 80s pastiche, and given the whole religious fanaticism that we were also talking about, I do feel like it is a missed opportunity to not include something from Motley Crue, Shout at the Devil, or even
Or
something
just
like Burning
hair
Hell.
bands in general. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Brendan. My guest on my episode this week, we talked about MaXXXine. He pointed that out, that he was kind of
really?
shocked by the lack of hair metal, not only in the music, but on the streets of LA. Like you didn't really see
Yeah.
anybody, looking like a member of Motley Crue, which I guess in that era, they were all over the place.
They were, yeah. And if
so-
there are any points of location here that were maybe close to, let's say, the Whiskey A Go Go at that time, which
Right.
was like the hop and spot for 80s glam metal of the 1980s, I was kind of surprised by that, because I mean that is a guilty pleasure genre of mine. It doesn't influence me
Oh,
as a
yeah.
musician, but it is fun music if I'm being
Sure,
honest.
absolutely. I agree.
And I think that would have been a great opportunity to kind of fit the mold a little bit here. But we do, I do like the versatility of the soundtrack. Regardless, we do get
Yeah.
some of that metaliness. I know Judas Priest is in here somewhere. We get
Mhm.
New Order. We get Frankie Goes to Hollywood. So we get a couple of those, and I like the diversity of it. But yeah, I was surprised by the lack of some of the 80s glam side of that music
Yeah.
scene, especially with Motley Crue, given the themes of this movie.
Yeah, I mean, as far as a few final thoughts, I will say to that point, as you guys were talking about the music, and I agree, the soundtrack here is really great. Now that I've seen the film, I do think on a rewatch, knowing what to expect in terms of storytelling and character, I think I'll be able to enjoy the film in terms of those diverting qualities a little bit more. I think I'll be able to
Yeah.
lean into them, because I already know I'm going to be disappointed by the story and the use of MaXXXine's arc here and how deflating that is for me. Knowing that ahead of time, I do think I'll be able to just simply sit back, relax, and enjoy those visuals and aesthetics and sounds a little bit more. So on a rewatch, I'll probably end up more in your guys' camp than where I'm at now. But
Okay.
coming off the heels of X and Pearl, that has this incredibly hefty and assiduous, texture to it that I absolutely adored. I walked into this film expecting that, and it's such a wild departure that it completely took me out of the experience. And it's frustrating, because for every moment where I did have some fun or I could sense those diverting qualities. The very next moment was bogged down in all of this other nonsense we've been talking about. And it just, the volatility of that just left me completely disengaged by the end. But I think on a rewatch, I'll be able to come around a little bit. I'll still be disappointed by the film overall, but I think
It's still going to
at
be the
least in
lesser of the
terms
three regardless.
Yeah, exactly, no matter
it
what.
will
But I
be.
think, yeah, on the next go round, I'll at least be able to tap into those entertaining moments a little bit more. Justice for Leon, by the way. Speaking,
Justice for Leon. I
Justice
love it.
for Leon, awesome
And
character.
to add on to what you're saying, I think when I do rewatch these, because I'm going to rewatch it too, but I'm going to start with Pearl. I'm going to do Pearl, X, and
We're
Okay.
watching in
MaXXXine, and
order.
just kind of
Yeah.
do it as an experiment, and just kind of, because I really feel like this is a double header to X, and I don't necessarily. I mean, the ending is bad in this movie. I don't necessarily think Pearl has anything to do with that, but I do think that, like I said in the top, because I wasn't trying to spoil it then, I do think that it
Yeah.
was perhaps to Maxine's detriment because, like I said earlier, Pearl is a borderline masterpiece for me, and you're following that up with what we got here. So even though
Yeah.
even though I might say it's good and I recommend it, it's not Pearl. I'm following that up, and that's a
Yeah.
tall order, and I'm talking
It
about
is.
from my perspective. So yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing I'll note to reiterate something that Gerald mentioned earlier, while again, I don't want to criticize the film for being something it's not, which is why I avoided it to this point. But simply as a talking point, just as three individuals talking about a movie, I agree wholeheartedly with you, Gerald, that the missed opportunities of this film are interesting to consider, because if this ended up going down a Quentin Tarantino kind of way, or Titanic, I would have
There
never
you go.
thought that's a reference that would be thrown out here. But it
this
makes a
ends
lot
in
of
the
sense.
biggest tearjerker you would imagine.
Like, it makes a lot of sense. Like, if the film ended up recontextualizing the history here in its favor that tethers itself to MaXXXine, man, I think you make a really great point there, that the film could have been really great if that was the case. But
Yeah.
to simply have all of that stuff simmering in the background and it never ties to Maxine's story at all, I don't understand what we're doing here.
Also, I mean, let's be honest, guys. Mia Goth would definitely let Kevin Bacon float on the door. I mean,
She would.
Yeah.
they would, I mean, they're not going to die out there in their frigid
Yeah.
waters.
There's
you know?
enough room for his teeth on that board.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, with all of that said, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, if you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment below. You can reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Gerald, thanks for being here, my friend. This was a ton
man.
of fun, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a blast for me too. I'm a big fan of you guys, as I said, and it was a thrill to be here and talk about a movie that I kind of liked. So
Yeah.
thanks for having me.
course, man.
Absolutely. Tell us about Two Peas on a Pod, everything you're up to, and where can we find you online?
Yeah, man. Just go to 2peasonapod.com. That's TWO spelled out. I also usually point people towards our YouTube page just because the podcast is there as well. And then occasionally I'll do top 5 lists and trailer reactions and all kinds of stuff. I'm on a bit of a video editing hiatus right now since I started my new job, but you can still get the podcast on YouTube anyway, and I'll get back in the game here before long. But
All right.
you can also follow me on Twitter, X, and all that stuff as well. But thank you guys for having me. It means a lot
Yeah,
that I was
man.
able to come
Yeah,
on and
thanks for
hang out
being
with
here.
you guys for a little while.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a blast. Really appreciate you being here. Please go give Gerald a follow. Check out his podcast. It's absolutely fantastic. Could not recommend it enough. So yeah, really do appreciate you. I do want to quickly note that we'll have a review for Horizon coming soon as well. So you can be on the lookout for that. Our latest main show episode 593 is currently up right now. We we round out our Best Picture movie series as far as the 1940s are concerned. We'll take a little bit of a break and come to another decade at some time down the road. But we have concluded at least the 1940s, and that was a lot of fun. So you can go and check
Some good movies.
that out as well. And Brendan and I while we didn't anticipate it, we talk a lot about Miami Vice and our review of Miami Vice.
We kind of
some years ago.
re-reviewed that movie in a weird way. We're gonna have to do another round on that one.
Yeah.
One of the most infamous reviews we've ever done on In Session.
Yep, absolutely. But had to bring it up with all of the discourse around that film over the last week or so. So go and check all of that out. With that said, fellas, any final thoughts on anything before we get out of here?
Mia Goth, please marry me if you're listening. That's it.
I just want that beard. I just want that beard.
It's gorgeous.
Sure. I'll give you all the gray hairs. I'll send those to you.
All right. My wife said she likes the salt and pepper look. She keeps on trying to get me to grow my facial hair out, but I think I look better without it.
I don't know. You need to do a before and after. Grow it and.
Oh, okay. You know what? You should find my personal Instagram because I did do that during COVID.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I'll check
and
that out.
I did a trio of photos of it down to like here. It wasn't quite as long as yours, and then I shaved everything except the mustache, and shaved the rest of it off.
Okay, I'll check that out.
Yeah, you have to stalk me on Instagram for that one.
Yeah, man.
I could never mimic what you have. If I could, though, I would have the most epic hockey beard in all of South Florida. And I think I would be extremely popular if that was the case. But I can't do it. This is the best I got.
And admittedly, I tried doing
good.
just doing the mustache in preparation for our in preparation for our review of Horizon to try and do my Costner look, but it didn't quite come in time to do it properly. But I might still go for it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dude,
Well, there you
Costner's
go.
a beast. I love that guy. Such an interesting filmography. I'm looking forward to listening to the review and seeing the movie. I haven't seen Horizon yet, but I really want
I'd be
to.
curious to get
same.
your thoughts on it.
Yeah. Well, with all of that said, again, Gerald, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast.